Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Melissa Kong, and I have the pleasure of representing the EXCO of the Oxford and Cambridge Malaysia Society today as one of your moderators. During today's webinar, we will be looking at the future of esports, specifically how Formula One motored on during the pandemic. Joining us today is one of our alumni, Dr. Julian Tan, who heads the Formula One digital strategy and global esports business to find out more about the future of sports and esports in the new normal, and focusing specifically on how F1 has navigated the challenges of operating during this pandemic. Julian was previously a senior consultant at the Boston Consulting Group and holds a first-class bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Oxford, as well as a PhD in the micromechanics of carbon fibre laminates from the University of Cambridge. He also recently participated in one of our student outreach events in partnership with Project ID, a local social enterprise focused on cultivating student leaders. Outreach event. Thank you for joining us today, Julian.
Thank you for having me. Quite excited to be here.
Yeah.
From London, yes. I'm dialing in from London.
Yeah, thank you for making time for us. I'd also like to introduce my fellow moderator for today, Hengji. Hengji is currently a third-year student in civil engineering at Christchurch College, Oxford University. He is passionate about the integration of digital technology in the civil engineering industry, as well as the social economic development that civil engineering contributes to society. Outside of academics, he spearheads the finance and sponsorship department of Young Malaysian Engineers and co-moderated their webinar series, which involved top recruiters and professionals from Shell, Accenture, LinkedIn, and Future Lab. Hengji also co-founded a club to develop survival skills among urban students during his college days. Thank you for coming on board to moderate with us today, Hengji.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. I'll start with the first question. My cat is also joining us in the background. This is Elsa. Okay. So Julian, given my lack of exposure to the industry, I think a great introductory question to ask would be how big is the esports industry and what is F1's history with esports?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me, as I said, and hello to Elsa in the background. Esports is, in definition of what it is actually competitive gaming. So in the same way that you would probably think about the professional level of, say, playing tennis, where you have Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, these are professionals playing the sport of tennis. Esports is the virtual equivalent that's based on a video game. So, in the same way that you will have professionals who are the best in the world, who are competing on a particular platform, whether that's League of Legends or Fortnite, or in our case, the Formula One video game, you'll have those professionals who basically play the video game professionally and make money out of it and create value in terms of entertainment content for people to kind of consume. The industry of esports is a rapidly growing industry. Currently, in 2020, it's about $1 billion industry. And it's sort of projected to grow to, 1.6 billion in 2023. So a very rapidly growing industry. But still, I think a drop in the ocean when you kind of consider the wider gaming industry, right? The wider gaming industry is, I think, upwards of $160 billion. So, it's less than 1% of that wider sort of gaming industry. But that sort of professional competitive gaming, i.e. esports, is widely consumed. There are a lot of people who tune in to, watch other people play video games professionally. This year in 2020, there's a projected sort of 500 million people in terms of the audience size. And that's expected to grow at about a 10% CAGR over the next sort of 3 to 4 years. So it's an industry that is experiencing a lot of growth. And one that Formula One as a company or as a sport actually decided back in 2017 that this was an interesting place to explore and to navigate and try and build our capabilities and skills within this space. And I think central to that, it was really a recognition that Formula One as a sport is obviously a sport with an illustrious history. You know, we're celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. But also coming with that, I think that's no secret that we acknowledge that we have an aging fan base. You know, the fan base that we have, it's important that we start thinking and operating in places that can help to kind of, you know, help us reach out to a younger generation and sort of start building that pipeline of fans into the sport of Formula One. And we very quickly identified that actually esports is a very powerful way to do that, you know, to create a product within this space that allows us to speak to the younger generation in a language that they understand. And that was really the main objective for us to decide that we would jump in, because back in 2017, when I say that we jumped into the world of esports, I really mean it in every sense of the phrase, because we had very little expertise in the space. We you know, were aware of it, but you know, it wasn't an area that I would say that we were particularly up to speed with. So we had to learn very quickly. But it served us very well, you know, sort of after launching in 2017, our sort of virtual championship to kind of mirror our real world championship. It grew very rapidly. We very quickly had all 10 Formula One teams participating in our series. So sort of in the same way that we've got the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari and Red Bull competing on the real life track, they've also formed esports teams to compete in the Formula One esports series. So you can get signed on to become an esports driver for an official Formula One team to compete in our series. So our championship, our sort of tournament that we've kind of been organizing is 3 years old right now. And you know, at the start of this year, when COVID-19 hit and was at its peak, and pretty much the whole sports industry had to go dark, we were in a very, I guess, as with the rest of the industry, in a very difficult position to kind of think, how could we sort of navigate what is a very difficult situation? You know, at the end of the day, our core product is racing on the track, and if we are unable to do that, pretty much, you know, what can we do? And we were, you know, I think having had that foresight back in 2017 to build our capabilities in esports, it became very clear that there was a real opportunity for us to use our digital capabilities that we had, you know, invested in and grown to put on what we called virtual Grand Prix. So in the absence of having real life Grand Prix, because if they're either postponed or canceled because of COVID-19, where at least we were able to kind of put on racing action virtually. And that's what we did. We did a virtual Grand Prix series over the course of 3 months, 2 to 3 months, when our sport had to go dark. Thankfully, we've gone back racing again, starting with last weekend, and we're racing again in Austria this weekend. But it's been a terrific ride, I would say, in terms of us continuing to build that capability, that digital capability, and sort of that innovative product to help plug a little bit the gap that we had seen. You know, keeping a couple of lights on, because one, we were able to deliver racing action to our fans, which was really, really important to us. And two, we were also able to kind of continue to deliver value for our sponsors, right? Our sponsors, our broadcast partners, continue to give them racing action, albeit virtually. And I think one thing that was also really unique was through our virtual Grand Prix series, we were able to give fans a new insight into their heroes, into their drivers. You know, I think we are a very unique sport in that our athletes, they compete behind a helmet. So, you know, you can't see their raw emotions as they're performing, but with esports, we're able to do that because they're streaming pretty much their lives on Twitch at the time. And so being able to kind of give them unprecedented insight and access to their drivers, I think is one of the key, it's one of the key advantages of us developing our capabilities in esports. And I think sort of related to that accessibility point, again, Formula One is not an accessible sport. I mean, we can say that, you know, openly. It's not like football where you can pick up a football and then play in your local field. But, you know, you can't just jump into an F1 car, right? So for us, esports actually plays a really important role in actually breaking down those barriers, because when you're competing in esports and when you're competing on a Formula One game, you can compete with a wheel, you can compete with a pedal, you can compete with the simulators. It's a very immersive way to break down those barriers into our sport.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Julian. I'll go on to the next question. So personally, I did a coursework module with Williams in my it's my second year. So basically, we were designing like the rear wing of one of the cars for like I think the Monza track, which required
Mm,
quite high like downforce. So the thing is like I realized that that aerodynamics of like F1 cars is actually one of like the biggest deciding factors in the performance of the car. So and my question is, would the F1 esports like drivers or gamers expect such like sophisticated modifications to the cars in the
mm.
game in the future?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that kind of stripping it back to the fundamentals of the role that the video game is serving. The video game itself is a commercial product for the mass market, right? I think it is the sole purpose of it in a big sense is actually to provide gaming entertainment. And we've taken that to the next level to create a virtual championship based on that video game. So I think that its main focus, I would say, is to maintain accessibility, but actually the realism aspect is actually a really attractive part of what makes a great product, particularly in our operating in virtual motorsports. That is true. So a lot of effort, I would say, has been done and will continue to be made to try and make the game to be more realistic, whilst I think trying to make it accessible, right? Because I think those two things are in some ways in competition with each other. The more realistic it is, the more difficult it is for people to pick up the game, and hence less accessible. And so it's a constant sort of it's a balance that we're trying to continue to optimize, where we want to continue to increase the realism, whether that's in terms of the car handling or whether that's in terms of how it looks visually, and also how accessible it can be to the mass market. And we work with our licensee Codemasters who develop our Formula One game, and they're the market leader when it comes to racing games. And they've done a terrific job. F1 2020, which actually just launched yesterday, our newest video game, I would say is probably the most sophisticated when it comes to simulation and realism. And I think there's still a lot, there's still a lot more potential, I would say, in terms of developing our product set, whether that is within the same product, i.e. our official Formula One game, or whether it's a separate product that is maybe focused purely on making it pure simulation, where the kind of the use case for that would be maybe slightly different, right? Because when we're talking about high-end simulation game, that really just appeals to probably the more hardcore avid fans, and maybe those who are actually looking to almost cross the chasm to become a real life racer. That's maybe 0.01% of the wider kind of audience. And the 99.9% want to just have fun playing a video game on the Formula One game. So it's actually really just trying to figure out that balance and the appropriate product set to meet those different objectives.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that insight. Julian, do you think there will be a point in the future where the size of F1 esports overtakes the physical F1?
That's a good question. I personally don't think so. And the reason why I say that is because our role or the strategic positioning of Formula One esports is always as a what I would call a pillar to growing our main product, which is the real life race. Everything that we're doing in esports is to grow our sport of Formula One. And whilst esports as an industry is growing very rapidly, I think that where we occupy, sort of the space that Formula One occupies within that industry, is a very unique one. It is the genre of sim racing. It is a genre that has the added benefit where the virtual world and the real world sort of collide in a very meaningful way. And I say that sort of meaning that when you are performing very highly at a very high level on the video game, there are sort of transferable skills that you can take in the real world to become a real life driver, and vice versa. A real life driver can pick up a video game and actually perform really well on it. So because of actually having that what I would call the blurring of lines between gamer and racer, which I would say is a very unique position to be in, being a sport operating in esports. Whereas, I would use comparisons like, League of Legends or say FIFA, for example. It's not, you don't necessarily have the same dynamic. So because we are occupying in that very unique space, we're able to use esports in a very meaningful way to kind of drive wider objectives, or wider strategic objectives for Formula One as a sport. And I think that that's where the value that we really have as a property operating in esports to drive that. So, I think that everything that we think about in terms of shaping our esports product and, how do we shape our tournament? How do we shape the accessibility in terms of how to get the content? All of that there's a large part of it that's guided by how we can actually use that to grow our wider sport. And esports is one of the many pillars, right? It's not the only pillar for growing our sport. Digital in general, of which esports is one of the pillar, I think is a very important part of growing the sport of Formula One. And that goes from, our OTT app, our F1 TV app, where you can live stream races straight to your mobile devices, to, your social media strategy. Which platforms are you going to be on? How are you going to play your content on there? So all of these different initiatives all serve that wider need, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question about accessibility. So basically, in order, say, if I want to like start a esports F1 career, I would, just like you mentioned, I would need a wheel, or need to get like the pedals. There's a lot of like equipment needed, and sometimes this can be actually quite pricey for like the high performance ones. And so there would be a sort of like gap between participants who want to like participate in a virtual Grand Prix. So like, what is F1 doing to provide better access to sort of this like gaming equipment to the gamers?
I mean, I think we see it in the sense that, where are we starting from, right? We're starting from, a really sort of highly inaccessible industry. And I think that first step is actually, how do we break that down? You're right. I think that virtual racing still requires a level of investment that not everyone can access. But I think that is probably, there are two things there. I think one, that is probably a reality of any high performing sports. As you go higher, you need a higher level of investment. There's that dynamic. But also equally, I think that there is also the dynamic whereby we are starting from a position where accessibility is almost, very, very low. And now we have the opportunity for people to get involved in the sport through a virtual way with our video game. I think that that's a big step forward, but I agree there's a lot more that can be done and should be done to kind of break down those borders. I think having to think about it in a different way, and sort of not necessarily thinking about it in the same way of, okay, you need to go through the wheels and pedals and become a racer, but also there are other ways that you can immediately open up the sport. And gaming, I think, is a very big part of that, mobile gaming in particular. So, I think things like the things that we're doing in the mobile space, where you can download the Formula One game for free and, play the F1 game. It may not be a wheel or pedal, but you have your mobile phone, right? And you can still engage in the kind of the world of motorsports and racing. I think is obviously important, and that is a big part, particularly in places like in the East, where mobile gaming is really big, and necessary console, for example, maybe it's not as highly penetrated because of the costs and barriers to entry over there on that side. So I think that it's a long journey, and I think that having to think about different ways in which you open up a sport is important, because one, providing the opportunity to engage in the world of F1 through video gaming, through console video gaming and wheels and pedals, is that first step away from that first engagement being karting, which is very, very, very expensive, right? It costs hundreds of thousands of pounds to maintain a career in karting, to now all you need to do is own a Formula One game, the wheel and pedal, and you can get a portion of that experience to kind of get you along that journey. And then it's sort of, how do you think about removing barriers even further for certain parts of the world who maybe don't have the access to the equipment or to the investment that's needed. And there are other ways that you can do that, whether it's mobile gaming or we do Obviously, pre-COVID era, we had festivals where we would have a set number of festivals around the world that's free to access for our fans. And within those festivals, we have activations in them, F1 esports activations being one of them, giving fans a chance to kind of engage in the world of F1. They don't have to own the equipment, but we bring the equipment to them. So I think it's sort of thinking about it in a flexible way to kind of reach different objectives.
Cool. We'll zoom out from esports a little bit, I think, towards sporting in general. Can you share a little bit about what measures F1 is taking to address the new health and safety standards in the new normal?
Yeah, I think it's a reality that everyone is having to deal with. Sport in particular is a very unique industry, I would say, because live sport and fans attending sport actually is a huge part of the experience, right? So not being able to do that is, I think, a big challenge for sport in general. But for the sport of F1, I think that we are an international sport. Yes, we travel the globe and we have, a lot of fans that attend the races, but at the same time, we touch a lot more fans through our broadcasts. A lot more people, engage with Formula One, not necessarily by going to a GP, a Grand Prix themselves, but actually watching the races on TV. So I think that we recognize that, and I think that was a big reason as to why we wanted to go back racing, even if it's behind closed doors. And there are several things that we're having to do, and I think that obviously in the situation of COVID-19, health and safety is of utmost importance, right? I think one of the most important things to do is to test. You won't know where you are until you're able to test and actually see where you are. So regular testing is actually one of the core pillars now that we're going back to racing, to ensure that we can manage safe racing, so that you're able to kind of isolate problems if they do flare up. So regular testing is number one. And actually, in our first race last weekend in Austria, we conducted over 4,000 tests, and we're very happy and very grateful to be able to confirm that not a single one of them was positive. So we're completely clean crew. So regular testing, very important. Secondly is closed events. So obviously, as I said, to go back safely, you need to do it in an environment that you can actually sort of have a lot more control over. And unfortunately, that means that we're having to go back racing without fans, which is, not the ideal situation. But we recognize that that's probably the only way to kind of do it at the moment in this current climate. But hopefully, as things start to open up a little bit, we'll start to be able to kind of incorporate, live attendance in there, because I think, as with sport, live attendance is an important one. It's just how do we do that in a safe way. Third, I would say that it's minimizing personnel. So cutting back the number of people who are really truly needed to operate a Grand Prix. In light of COVID-19, actually, this is the first time we've actually done remote production. So everything is actually done from a production perspective, done in our office in Beacon Hill in London now, rather than sort of traveling with the operations to kind of do that. And minimizing personnel who actually attend the races themselves, who attend the paddock, who attend the circuit. And then fourth, I would say isolated travel. So you have minimized personnel, but you have bubbles that you're able to kind of isolate. So not having people just commingling, you maintain your bubble throughout the race weekend and in between the races as well. And lastly, I would say is social distancing. So once you're there, making sure that you're socially distanced, whether that's in the paddock or throughout the circuit. And that means that you're having to change operations entirely, within the paddock as to how you operate, the different aspects of that, but also, pre and post race activities, whether that is the national anthem or Parc Fermé or the podium, how are those operated socially distanced? So all of those processes sort of need to be and have been altered and adapted so that we're able to kind of socially distance. So it's those 5 things I would say that has enabled us to kind of go back racing safely. but yeah, I think that you need to kind of have a very high level of health and safety in order to come back in this climate, because you're responsible, right, as a sport, to the people working in the sport as well. So it's making sure that we can put on that product, but more importantly, put on that product in a safe way for our personnel, our fans. And I think that with these sort of 5 steps, we've been able to do that, at least in what we've seen in our first Grand Prix, which, I think has been a huge success on that front, and hoping to continue that throughout the season.
Okay. So the next question would be that, because right now, due to the COVID-19, border controls are very tight, and F1, I've read in an article that F1 is actually might reduce the number of races per season to only 8 races from a usual of around 20 races. So in that case, then F1 will probably would definitely have like lower revenue. And so my question to you is that, would F1 still be like financially sustainable then? Because I'm very sure like many fans would like who are many avid fans of F1 would miss the game, would miss the sport if like it can't be continued just because it's not financially sustainable.
Yeah, I think that the ambition for us is to actually have 15 to 18 races this year. That is what we're aiming for, and we've confirmed so far 10 races actually. So yesterday we announced 2 extra races, one in Mugello for Ferrari's 1000th race, which is sort of in Italy, and a very significant place for them. And we also announced Sochi in Russia. So now we have a confirmed calendar of 10, and we have more to be announced. So we have every intention to have between 15 and 18 races this year. But you're right. I mean, because our core product, kind of going back to that, the core product is the racing. And when you talk about the commercials and the financials behind that, it is through the racing. So if you're not able to go back racing, obviously that has a huge knock-on effect on all of the different sort of revenue streams that you mentioned. Formula One has 3 main revenue streams. One is the sponsorship aspect of things, promoter fees. So the fees that the promoters who put on the Grand Prix pay Formula One in order to put on the Grand Prix themselves, in large part sort of funded through tickets, so people who are attending the Grand Prix. And then the third is media rights, so the broadcast fees. These are, I would say, the primary revenue sources. And as you can see, they're all dependent on being able to kind of go back racing. So it's really important for the health of our sport, and just sport in general, actually, to have the sport happening. If not, it's going to be very challenging from a financial perspective. So this year, obviously, we had an initial ambition to have 22 races. It was going to be our biggest race season. But obviously, in celebration with our 70th anniversary this year, we turned 70 years this year. But obviously, COVID-19 threw a spanner in the works there. So having to kind of adapt to that, I think, has been a very it's been a very challenging thing. But we've got some really talented people working on making sure that we can continue racing. And I think that we have really great leadership in place to ensure that we're able to kind of do that.
Yep. Melissa, maybe you might want to ask the next one.
Okay, sure. I feel it's more appropriate for you to ask because I hardly know anything about aerodynamics, to be honest.
Aerodynamics. I hope I do.
No, I'm not like, I wouldn't be asking about like the particulars of like the aerodynamic design or all that, but like I'm just that I did that project and I realized that these like Formula One teams, they invest a lot in like doing tests for like the aerodynamics of a car. And right now, due to this COVID-19 situation, then definitely they would have less revenue, and so the development of like the aerodynamics would be hindered. And so like how is like F1 trying to help their teams to address this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that that's obviously the viability of the teams within the kind of ecosystem of Formula One obviously is an important consideration, right? I think that the multiple things that have been done, we've announced, changes in the rules and regulations. We were supposed to have new rules and regulations coming in next year. Those have been postponed. Aspects around development and the usage of the cars for next year will very much mirror, the cars that are being used this year. So trying to kind of limit or trying to manage, I guess, the impact that COVID-19 is having on a financial perspective on really the growth and the development on the technological side of the sport, I think is one way in which you can start to, support the kind of management, I suppose, of COVID-19. So I think from a rules and regulations perspective, that has been the case. We've obviously announced, budget caps on future regulations with the teams and with the cars. So the sustainability of the sport obviously is one of, I would say, when Liberty came in back in 2017, was identified as a core pillar to kind of navigate, because if we don't correct its course, you can see that the health of the sport is at risk, right? The health of the sport, where you don't have that competition. You have one team running away with each championship. A sport needs to be competitive, and in order to maintain that competitive nature, rules and regulations play a really big part in that. So it's not an easy process, because Formula One is a very complex ecosystem. There are a lot of politics and a lot of different stakeholders with varying degrees of influence and power. So being able to do what you call, quote unquote, the right decision is oftentimes very, challenging to do. But, we have, like I said, a terrific leadership team. Ross Braun, who heads up the sort of sporting side, the motorsport sporting side, along with Chase, our CEO, they've really been pushing the sort of, together with the FIA, the sustainability aspect through rules and regulations for the sport. Because ultimately you can build all of these great digital products and great marketing aspects and, great sort of deals with broadcast partners and stuff like that. But if your core product is not exciting, if you don't have a good racing product, then it's for nothing. Like, it all comes down to having a great racing product. And the kind of the competitiveness of the teams and the cars are a huge part of that. So, it's a really big, I would say, a really important strategic objective for us that was identified. And I think that we've made some really significant steps in that space, having announced our 2021 regulations now being moved to 2022, and how we're going to be managing the kind of the season next year in relations to this year with COVID-19.
Can you share maybe a little bit more about how F1 hopes to make up, I think, for the drop in revenue that you're now that you're not able to make revenue through your traditional revenue streams because of the new normal?
I mean, I think there is a wider recognition and appreciation beyond Formula One that all businesses have been severely impacted by COVID-19. I think that to say that we will reach the same targets that we had before is unrealistic, and we have had to revise our targets and our expectations in light of COVID-19. But ultimately, I mean, maximizing the number of races we can do, that has a big knock-on effect on the kind of the revenues. Being innovative in terms of our digital propositions. I think that whilst COVID-19 has had a huge impact on the live experience space, digital and gaming, these sort of aspects have seen a huge surge during lockdown, right? People are spending more time at home. People are spending more time on video games. They're spending more time on the internet. So how can we sort of use those, those capabilities to serve the sport more widely, right? I think that the engagement on our Formula One game over COVID-19 was tremendous. We saw, actually over 1,000% increase month on month from a streaming hours perspective on Twitch. So more and more people were playing the video game and streaming it on Twitch, which meant that also more people were buying the video game. People were engaging more in Formula One. And also I think that has a knock-on effect now that we've gone back racing. Actually, last weekend was our biggest weekend ever on digital in terms of unique users, page views. So the activities that we did during COVID-19 clearly has had an impact on how strongly we've come back last weekend. But I don't think anyone is under any illusions that this is going to be a tough year. It is going to be a very, very tough year. And it's, I think trying to navigate this space and trying to emerge from it so that we can grow stronger from it. I think that you will see that a lot of businesses in this time have gone bust, and have not had the resources to continue carrying on, and that is a really, really devastating impact. And I think for us, we need to try and get through this, try and get through this as best as we can. And hopefully, things will get better, and they will get better. And try and prove resilient through that point, and try and grow stronger, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's everyone. I'm sure. I mean, I talk a bit from the perspective of sport, but when you talk about wider industries as well, I think for me at least, there's an appreciation that sport, yes, there's a great role that sport can play in terms of people's lives by providing entertainment and providing relief, but there are a lot of other businesses out there, some you would probably deem as more critical, that will find it extremely difficult to navigate and emerge from this crisis. So yeah, it's a difficult time for everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next question, basically. So Formula One, I think you released like a report some time ago that that says that a race season usually emits about 256,000 tons of equivalents of like CO2. So, and like many have been like questioning the effects of like to the environment of the sport. So how does like Formula One address this?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, sustainability is a huge, I think a huge hot topic at the moment. I think Formula One for us, we are acutely aware of where we are. And it's exactly the reason why at the end of last year, November of last year, we actually announced our strategy as well as our ambitions to go net carbon neutral by 2030 and to go fully sustainable in our events by 2025. We outlined in there actually a range of different things from the logistics side, which actually forms a big part of the emissions. It's not necessarily the cars themselves that in terms of the number or percentage or proportion of emissions, actually most of it comes from actually traveling around the globe and putting on what would be a festival, a Super Bowl weekend in each of these different cities. And it's that logistics side, I think, that contributes to a big part. So outlining the strategies around that, whether you optimize your travel a little bit more, instead of taking air freight, you go to shipping, and planning and optimizing your routes. Those sort of things will help tremendously. I think we also outlined aspects around our facilities and the factories and offices, and going sort of renewable energy, renewable operations, those sort of things. But I think at the core of it, I think there's also I think taking a step back, Formula One as a sport has actually played a very important role in the automotive industry in terms of pioneering technologies. I call it the sort of the race to road transfer of technology, right? A lot of the technologies that you see in everyday vehicles right now were actually pioneered through motorsports and through Formula One. So there's a huge role, I think, that we can play in terms of having that aspect of trying to drive sustainability there. And actually, it doesn't get talked about as much, because when people tend to see the word electric, they immediately assume that that's highly sustainable. But actually, the hybrid engines that are used in Formula One are the world's most efficient engines out there. It's more efficient than going fully electric because 60% of electric energy is actually powered by coal. So at the end of the day, when you talk about net global emissions, the hybrid engine is still much more efficient and in some ways much more sustainable than going fully electric. And so I think we've obviously pioneered the development of hybrid engine, which is used in the wider automotive industry. And I think that the technologies that we use on that, I think, will be really important. And things like biofuels, for example, next year, 10% of the cars will have to use 10% biofuels in terms of fuels, and that spurred conglomerates around the world to actually start investing in the development of biofuels. And that has a huge impact, I would say, in terms of the wider industry and how that gets rolled out on a day-to-day basis. So I think there is a lot to be done. There is still a lot to be done on this front around trying to make the sport sustainable. And we've outlined in our sort of sustainability strategy how we will do that to go fully net carbon neutral by 2020-30. But also, I think there's a real opportunity, as we have always played, in terms of our role as leading innovators in motorsport, to actually figure out how we can introduce new technologies into mass usage, mass consumption, whether that is in terms of the sort of the engine that's being used or the fuels that's being used. I think that there's a real opportunity and also responsibility in a way that for us as the pinnacle of motorsport to actually chart that path.
Also, I have another question that's like I think it's very close to heart for like a lot of Malaysians. So I think somewhere in 2017, I think the Malaysian government just said, we just don't have the funds to host the Formula One race in Sepang. So, but then Malaysia has been doing quite well with the COVID-19 situation. They've pretty much contained the virus. And so, would you think, in your opinion, do you think that next year or probably somewhere in this season, there will be a comeback from Sepang International Circuit?
I think well, first of all, I actually when I joined Formula One in 2017, I managed to go for the final Sepang race. And obviously, as a Malaysian, I was, obviously a little bit disappointed and quite sad that was the last Formula One race in Sepang. I mean, I think there are a lot of different considerations to be made. It's not a straightforward sort of decision when you decide to go to a certain country to race. There are a lot of different elements that come on board. The obvious elements are, logistically, it has to kind of fit. Right now, all of our racing is happening in Europe, and it's, been sort of structured that way in the short to medium term because of the way in which we need to manage our logistics and how we travel and also local regulations. I think being a global sport, one of the challenges is actually how do you come up with a system that can flex with each local government and each local regulation. So I think there are a lot of different elements. There are other elements that maybe don't get seen as much. But from my perspective, being completely selfish, is why I'd love to see Formula One come back to Malaysia as a Malaysian. But I know that obviously discussions are wide ranging. Malaysia is not the only country, and I think in many ways we're very fortunate in that ways to be a sport where we have a lot of promoters who actually come to us and want to put on a Formula One race, because there are a lot of benefits actually by putting on a Formula One race economically. When you bring F1 to a particular country, there is huge indirect halo benefits of doing that. So we're very lucky to have a lot of different promoters come, approach us and want to kind of explore racing in our in their country. So I think thinking about it in the short, medium, and also in the long term, I know Malaysia always has a great circuit in Sepang. There are a lot of different components that need to come into place to decide that we will go back racing to a particular place. But again, like I said, I think we've got a great team who do a very good job in terms of figuring that out. And right now, I think, the kind of short to medium term, the fact that COVID-19 has disrupted the calendar in its entirety, having to kind of navigate that in the short to medium term is obviously a huge challenge. So yeah, I think that the team have a lot on their hands, but hopefully, I mean, hopefully in the medium and long term, there will be a deal to be struck there, and we can sort of come back racing in Sepang.
Cool. Thanks so much for sharing. I think from it's been an education for me. And I think I also appreciate, how intersectional your explanations have been around like the different challenges that F1 has been facing, and also like the other ways in which it intersects and impacts other areas that our audience may not necessarily be familiar with. We have a more personal question that came in via Instagram from Spring. She asks, what do you ultimately want to achieve with your career and life?
What do I want to ultimately achieve with my career and life? It's a very deep question.
Yeah.
I think that I've always lived my life in a similar way where I ride the wave. I tend to use the word I ride the wave. So, when I was in high school, I never thought that I would, first of all, be pursuing higher education in Oxford. Never in a million years. When I was in Oxford, I didn't think that I would go and do a PhD. And then when I was doing my PhD, I didn't think I would repivot entirely and go to management consulting and suddenly end up now in Formula One, heading their esports department. I think that is, I've never really like planned my life when I was young. I never said, oh, I want to be working for a sports organization. I want to be working for Formula One. I've always sort of lived my life as a journey as opposed to a destination. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, what I want to achieve in my life is that I want to, as everybody does, and as simplistic as the answer is, I want to be happy doing what I'm doing. So, and that is something that I don't have to strive for. That's something that I just have to do. That's something that I have to just consciously decide right now that I want to just enjoy it. So that ultimately is, in many ways, what I want to achieve in my life. I just want to ride the wave, whatever opportunity comes in, have fun with it, and see where it takes me. And, I think that ultimately a lot of people tend to have, ambitions and goals. I want to achieve this by that age. And I mean, in some ways I do, but I don't necessarily think that that's a hugely important part of what, if I get it, great. If I don't get it, that's completely okay as well. And I think that, that's just my own personal approach. And I think up to date, I've been able to kind of live what I would call I've been a very happy doing what I'm doing. And I think so long as I'm happy doing what I'm doing, I'll continue to do it. So I know it's not necessarily the most kind of like inspirational, this is what I want to do. I want to be a millionaire a billionaire when I'm 40 or 50, whatever that is. But I think that ultimately, again, work is only one aspect of your being, right? I think what I do at Formula One and, the work I do in esports or wider digital in Formula One is just an aspect of my role that I'm being hired to do, but that's not who I am, right? That's not who ultimately deep down inside who I am. I am me. So I think it's just making sure I recognize that Julian Tan, head of digital business initiatives and esports, that's just a title, right? At the end of the day, I am my own person and I have my own things that I like to do. So I was recently asked this question actually a while ago about like, what legacy do I want to leave? And I actually had to pause and think about that because I never really thought about that. Like, what legacy does one person want to leave? And I don't think about that. I never do think about, what sort of lasting impression I want to leave. What I do know is that for everybody that I meet and everybody that I get the privilege of working for, I want them to feel like they had a good experience and a positive experience working with me, and that they're somehow a little bit, even if it's 0.1% better off, knowing me than not. I think that for me is important. But sort of leaving a lasting legacy in the same way as Winston Churchill or a Michael Jackson is not what I strive for. Let's just say it's not what I strive for. But ultimately, I think I know a lot of people, as they're sort of navigating their lives, whether it's in university, or whether it's finding a job and stuff like that. I mean, I think that I can only speak from my own experience, but I find that it's so much more fulfilling to live life in the moment and live life in the present, and then look back on what you have achieved and enjoy that for what it is, as opposed to always looking for something to kind of chase for, and I don't know, maybe just being disappointed if you don't get it. I think it's important to have goals, and I think it's important to always give your all to kind of achieve those goals. But I think having the expectation to get it or tying your worth to that goal, I think is a very counterproductive, it's not a productive thing to do. So I don't know if that answers the question. But in essence, I think it's just sort of, I don't have one. I just want to live in the moment and enjoy what I'm doing and have fun with the people that I meet and the people that I get to know.
Yeah, that's fair. I think one thing I also wanted to ask, based on what you were sharing, I think one thing that kind of emerged was as a Malaysian working abroad, like Malaysia is still really close to your heart. What do you hope, I suppose, to do? I'm not sure what my question is, but I guess just kind of like, I don't know, will you hope to contribute to Malaysia in the future? If yes, how so?
It's a great question. I mean, when I was in university, I was very, I would say I was quite involved really in terms of, I think the kind of the local issues that was happening back in Malaysia. Obviously being in the UK, sort of being out there, being here and sort of seeing what's happening back in Malaysia, I was very passionate, I would say, and I still am. I think in many ways, after university, I actually thought that I would come back to Malaysia and sort of find something to do here. But I think that when I was at that crossroad of, do I go back to Malaysia or do I stay in the UK, I was sort of in a position where I had a job in the UK. And I didn't necessarily have a job offer in the UK. I didn't necessarily have a clear path. So at that point, maybe a little bit selfishly, I felt like, okay, let me just pursue, this work experience here in the UK, because I think that having experience working abroad is a valuable experience to have. And if you come back, you'll come back better for it. So that was the decision that I made. I mean, in many ways, I think being a Malaysian working abroad, you are a minority, and it is a very different circumstance. I would say that I would probably be the way in which you're treated here in the UK versus back in Malaysia is very different, because culturally I'm Malaysian. So, I would say that in terms of effectiveness, or in terms of like being able to be fully myself in that sense, is a much, I can do that much more powerfully back in Malaysia, just because, that's where I'm born and bred. But at the same time, I think being abroad right now and working and, interacting as a minority in many ways, I'm the only Malaysian in all of Formula One, right? And, 95 or upwards of 95% of the company are British. So, I think working in that environment will help you, or has helped me, or is helping me actually become a more effective person, a more effective leader. And yeah, I do have intentions to come back to Malaysia. I mean, in the long term, I think the question for me is actually figuring out what is that kind of that next step, and what is it exactly that, will be the thing that I'll be pursuing. And like with anything, like I said in life, I ride the wave. So, opportunity comes and I will ride it. I think ultimately there are a lot of different things that will need to come in place, but yeah, I do want to come back eventually. But I want to come back and be able to kind of be able to kind of contribute 100% of what I can contribute, not just come back for the sake of coming back. So, but yeah, Malaysia is my home. So I definitely want to come back.
hopefully sometime soon, but we'll see.
Yes, hopefully sometime soon. I was actually supposed to come back in June for a conference, but obviously for obvious reasons couldn't do that. But hopefully at the end of this year, I come back at least once a year, and I'm hoping I can do that again this year.
Inshallah. From an academic perspective, I wonder to what degree do you still apply your engineering background in your current job?
So I'd say my engineering background is split across two things. One is the content itself, so the principles and the maths, and the other is the way in which you think about solving problems. And I would say that education, particularly in engineering for me, was always more heavily, was more important to me that the second or the latter was actually more fully fulfilled than the former. And to answer your question, the former, none at all. I don't use any of it. Nothing of my PhD, you can believe it or not, across sort of fracture mechanisms and quasi-isotropic carbon fiber laminates. None of that is being used. But the way in which I think about solving problems, whether it is breaking down the problem and breaking down the problem in Oxford when I was like sort of building the bridge. We had a lab where you're building a bridge and you kind of just have to do it and you figure it out, to my PhD where I'm having to figure out a new experimental method to test carbon fiber laminates, for example. That process of being able to think of what is that exam question and how can I get to an answer, that I use on a daily basis, on an hourly, minute-by-minute basis. So I think for me, in many ways, actually, I see education as that. It's, yes, there is a content side of things where it's important that you understand that content. And particularly if you're going into an industry that requires you to understand that content, obviously that's super important. But actually, the super valuable thing about education for me is actually that problem-solving skills, that sort of perseverance, determination aspect of, okay, it's a hard topic, but I need to crack it. I may not love history, but I'm going to figure out how I can get an A. Like that kind of approach is, for me, so much more valuable than the content of knowing that World War I was between 1914 and 1918. Like that for me is so much more important. And I think education, whilst you're focused on the topic, you don't pay as much attention to actually how you get there and build those sort of softer skills. But you do get that if you prioritize academics, and I think that's really valuable. Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, I don't use any of my engineering at all. I actually made an observation the other day where, after I left Cambridge, obviously my PhD in Cambridge was in carbon fiber laminates, and so when I joined BCG, which is a management consulting firm, nothing, I didn't use any of that. And then I came back to Formula One, and this is the closest I've ever been back to carbon fiber laminates, because the cars themselves, they're made of CFRP. So it's been quite a funny kind of way to come back, but yeah, exciting nonetheless, I suppose.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. Do you have any questions, Angie?
No, I'm good.
You're good. Okay, cool. Well, maybe to wrap up, I'd like to ask if you have any last words that you'd like to share before we end.
Any last words? I mean, I think we're at F1 specifically, from a kind of professional role perspective. I think we're very, very excited that we're back racing again. Actually, right now we're having our FP3 practice. So really excited that we're back racing again, and hoping to kind of come back to some sense of normality soon. I think for the health of everyone, and to do that safely, of course. So I think that's really important. I think from a esports perspective, really excited about the potential that esports has on the company and on the sport in general, to continue to kind of grow Formula One, because I think that there is a huge opportunity that gaming and esports can play, particularly in the context of motorsports. And from a personal perspective, I suppose, kind of going back to my sort of, my experience and what I want to kind of do, I think just have fun in whatever you're doing, and always give your all. Yeah, always give your all and ride the wave. Always ride the wave.
Cool. Okay. I think we're coming up to like an hour. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation and the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Are you going to pull it off live now, Heng Ji?
Yeah.